20% of the world's oil just became a weapon, and the country that controlled it for decades just lost the war they didn't even know they were fighting. For years, Iran held a gun to the global economy's head through the Strait of Hormuz, one narrow waterway, 20 million barrels of crude oil flowing through it every single day. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps turned this choke point into their personal chessboard, deploying thousands of sea mines like a deadly welcome mat for any nation that dared challenge their authority. But something just shifted in the Persian Gulf that changes everything. Admiral Brad Cooper stood before Congress last month and delivered numbers that should terrify Tehran. 90% of Iran's pre-positioned mine stockpile has been destroyed. We're talking about 7,200 mines wiped from existence. The mathematical precision of this destruction tells you everything about how seriously Washington took this threat. But here's where this gets really interesting. Iran didn't just lose their mines, they lost the boats that plant them. 161 vessels belonging to the Revolutionary Guard and Iranian Navy now rest on the bottom of the Gulf. These weren't just any ships. These were the specialized mine-laying platforms, the modest, fast-attack craft that could slip into shipping lanes under cover of darkness and seed the waters with death. Think about what this means strategically. For decades, Iran leveraged an asymmetric advantage that let them threaten billion-dollar tankers and advanced warships with relatively cheap mines deployed from small boats. A handful of craft could theoretically close the strait, spike insurance premiums, trigger commodity market panic, and hand Tehran massive leverage in diplomatic negotiations. That entire doctrine just evaporated. The Revolutionary Guard celebrated Mosquito Fleet, those swarms of small craft that gave the Islamic Republic outsized influence over regional waters, has been systematically hunted to near extinction. What remains of Iran's mining capability either drifts randomly through shipping lanes or sits anchored in isolated positions without the systematic coverage that made them strategically significant. The careful choreography of terror that Iran orchestrated across Hormuz has devolved into scattered, uncoordinated threats. Meanwhile, American mine clearance operations advance with methodical precision. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, including USS Forrest Sherman and USS Michael Murphy, have already transited the strait despite active minefields, proving that freedom of navigation isn't just rhetoric, backed by substantial risk acceptance. Littoral combat ships, Avenger-class mine countermeasure vessels, and MH-60S helicopters equipped with specialized sensors maintain constant patrol throughout the operational area. Pentagon planners estimate complete clearance could require 6 months, but secure passage corridors are expanding faster than worst-case projections suggested. A growing number of commercial vessels can now make controlled transit through cleared lanes, and this capacity increases measurably each week. More importantly, as mine clearing advances sector by sector, the Navy positions forces at strategic locations on a permanent basis, creating infrastructure to suppress future Iranian provocations with devastating speed. Geographic areas the Revolutionary Guard once declared red lines, zones where American warships operated at substantial risk, have become increasingly accessible to surface vessels and unmanned systems operating under robust defensive coverage. From Tehran's perspective, this constitutes nothing less than comprehensive defeat of the asymmetric dominance doctrine they constructed over decades of focused development. Iran's response reveals just how desperate their position has become. Unable to threaten Hormuz effectively, the regime shifted to drone swarms and ballistic missiles, spreading calculated terror across the Gulf region. The Revolutionary Guard maintains thousands of one-way attack drones, including the Shahid 136 and its derivatives, along with ballistic missiles spanning multiple range categories. Iranian production reached approximately 10,000 drones monthly before this conflict, though targeted strikes have degraded portions of manufacturing infrastructure. During March and April, Iran executed hundreds of drone and missile attacks against American installations, petroleum facilities, and civilian infrastructure across the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Qatar. Several attacks struck tankers directly, triggered refinery fires, and caused civilian casualties in Gulf capitals. These operations, combined with the ongoing mine threat, held global energy markets hostage for months, driving insurance premiums to unprecedented levels. But here's what Iran didn't anticipate. The Gulf states abandoned their previous strategic patience and executed direct counterstrikes against Iranian territory. Saudi forces conducted airstrikes on missile production facilities inside Iran, while Emirati aircraft struck a strategically important oil refinery on Karg Island. Although these operations weren't publicly acknowledged in detail, they fundamentally altered regional power calculations. Gulf monarchies that pursued accommodation policies toward Iranian threats for years now demonstrated willingness and capability to conduct direct retaliation. The Trump administration has operated in exceptionally close coordination with the UAE and Saudi Arabia throughout this crisis. President Trump treats Gulf security concerns as core American interests, maintaining maximum pressure against Iran across diplomatic, economic, and military dimensions. Washington increased intelligence sharing with Emirati and Saudi counterparts, supported joint patrol operations, and signaled willingness to endorse harsher measures if escalation continues. According to assessments from international strategic analysis centers, the UAE and Saudi Arabia have urged Trump toward an even more decisive stance, advocating that Iran must be sufficiently weakened before any crisis resolution to prevent future escalation cycles. This represents a fundamental shift in regional dynamics. America's Gulf partners are no longer content to absorb Iranian aggression passively. Despite comprehensive pressure, Iran continues deploying remaining drone and missile stockpiles. Revolutionary Guard commanders still invoke propaganda slogans claiming Hormuz remains under their control, but operational reality reveals Tehran's actual leverage lies primarily in these airborne weapon systems. The regime attempts to activate proxy networks in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, opening additional fronts through surrogates to stretch American and allied resources across multiple theaters. This represents classic Iranian strategic methodology: avoid direct conventional warfare while increasing the adversary's costs through numerous, inexpensive, difficult-to-detect weapon systems deployed across extended geographic space. The limitations of this approach, however, are becoming increasingly apparent. American air superiority, advanced integrated air defense systems operated by Gulf states, and intelligence support from Israel have collectively reduced Iranian attack success rates. Substantial numbers of inbound missiles and drones are destroyed during flight, and those penetrating defensive screens typically cause only limited damage. Meanwhile, the Iranian economy, already severely strained by comprehensive sanctions and war-related damage, faces accelerating deterioration as the regime continuously expends these weapons. Since portions of production facilities have been destroyed, replacement rates for expended munitions have slowed considerably. Iran has largely exhausted its mining capability in Hormuz, while simultaneously depleting drone and missile inventories at unsustainable rates. This erosion across both strategic fronts forces Tehran toward diplomatic engagement despite rhetorical resistance. The determined American stance, increasingly active Gulf role, and Revolutionary Guard's eroding capacity collectively indicate a fundamentally new power balance crystallizing across the Middle East. The rapid degradation of both mine capability and drone missile arsenals has brought Tehran to a genuine strategic crossroads. The regime now confronts three basic pathways forward: complete capitulation to American demands, controlled tactical retreat while preserving core interests, or one final high-risk escalation designed to fundamentally alter the strategic equation. Thus far, the regime appears to have selected the second option, but the cost escalates daily. Iran's strongest remaining instrument involves indirect warfare conducted through extensive proxy networks across the region. These asymmetric groups still function as relatively inexpensive mechanisms, allowing the regime to project power without direct exposure. However, these proxies no longer demonstrate previous effectiveness. Houthi operations in the Red Sea have been substantially suppressed through robust international coalition interventions. Iraqi militia groups face increasing isolation due to domestic Iraqi public opposition to their activities. Another potential tool involves nuclear brinkmanship. Iran periodically reminds international audiences that it has accelerated nuclear development and raised uranium enrichment levels above 60% purity, approaching weapons-grade thresholds. This represents the strategic ambiguity policy the regime views as its ultimate insurance mechanism, but this card cuts both directions. Advancing toward nuclear weapons capability carries substantial risk of triggering far harsher military intervention from Israel and potentially direct American operations targeting nuclear infrastructure. The economic dimension represents perhaps the most painful pressure point for Tehran. The Hormuz crisis, combined with dramatically reduced oil export revenues, comprehensive sanctions architecture, and domestic economic collapse, has generated a serious legitimacy crisis for the regime. The Iranian rial has reached historic lows against hard currencies, official inflation exceeds 40%, and popular purchasing power continues eroding. Shortages of basic food items and fuel have emerged in several cities. Under these conditions, despite official victory narratives, domestic unrest grows steadily. The potential for protest waves similar to recent years' upheavals has become the primary nightmare for Iranian decision-makers. The fundamental question remains whether Iran will ultimately surrender to American pressure. Current indicators point toward controlled withdrawal rather than complete capitulation. While the regime acknowledges losses regarding mines and drones in Hormuz, it simultaneously seeks diplomatic and limited economic support from China and Russia. Beijing appears willing to play a mediating role driven by energy import requirements, while Moscow acts more cautiously given preoccupation with Ukraine. This dual support provides Tehran with tactical breathing room, but does not constitute strategic salvation. Meanwhile, the Trump administration's framework of settlement or intensified intervention continues narrowing Iranian options. Washington expects concrete Iranian steps toward any potential ceasefire arrangement, sharing precise coordinates of remaining mines in Hormuz, cessation of drone attacks, and verifiable rollback of nuclear enrichment activities. Regional dynamics are simultaneously shifting. Although Saudi Arabia and the UAE have signaled potential interest in normalization processes, both act with greater assertiveness as they observe Iranian weakness, exploiting the moment to secure more favorable long-term arrangements. This multi-layered pressure strains the Iranian regime across domestic and external dimensions simultaneously. The ultimate resolution of the Hormuz crisis now depends on far more than military capabilities alone. Diplomatic maneuvering, economic sustainability, domestic political stability, and shifting regional alliances operate as interconnected variables in a complex system. Although the Iranian regime maintains its axis of resistance rhetoric for domestic and regional audiences, decision-makers recognize their strategic cards are diminishing rapidly. The complete reopening of Hormuz and restoration of normal maritime traffic flows isn't merely a temporal question, but potentially the harbinger of a comprehensively restructured Middle Eastern balance. Tehran faces a binary choice: pursue controlled negotiated retreat to minimize losses, or attempt one final high-risk escalation that could catastrophically backfire. At this moment, the advantage appears to rest decisively with Washington and Gulf capitals. The question that will define the next phase of Middle Eastern geopolitics is whether Iran's leadership recognizes that their decades-long stranglehold over global energy security has been broken permanently. Will they accept this new reality and negotiate from a position of weakness, or will desperation drive them toward nuclear brinkmanship that could trigger the very regime collapse they're desperately trying to avoid?